Everybody, it's me, Dan Sexton, Mr. Excitement, and today I'm newsman Mr. Excitement because I've got some breaking news. It's really not breaking. It actually kind of got settled out late last year, in 2024, that the National Association of Realtors settled a series of antitrust lawsuits for a total of $418 million. Now, what was this lawsuit about? It was about the lawsuit claimed that NAR and its members, realtors and brokers, engaged in practices that artificially inflated real estate commissions, thus violating U.S. antitrust laws. Now, let's take a minute and stop right here because I want to first say I am not an attorney, a real estate attorney. I am just giving you information that was shared through the National Association of Realtors website. You can see that below. Please reference that if you want more detail, but I'm going to kind of cover the highlights. Now, what were the four main components of this lawsuit? Number one, they say we inflated commission rates. Well, they claim that we created a system where home sellers were required to offer compensation to buyer's agent. Well, number one, that's, in my opinion, false. It was never required. It's always been an option for sellers to offer compensation to buyer's agents. Now, it's been a general practice, I would agree, that the commissions that were always talked about in a listing appointment were what the listing agent would charge for their services, and that they would split that commission with a cooperating broker if they brought a buyer to purchase your house. That commission that a seller offered to the listing agent has always been negotiable. As a matter of fact, on almost every listing appointment I've ever been on, the seller has asked, is there any way we can negotiate down this commission? Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. It just depends on the level of service that I am going to provide to that seller. Number two main reason. They feel that there was anti-competition practices. The plaintiffs argued that NAR commission structure discouraged competition by standardizing commission rates. Well, as we all know, the commission rates are, they always say, hey, they're standard, they're 6% or 5% or whatever. Nothing was standard. As I said about the first bullet, commissions have always been negotiable at the listing appointment. One of the big things was that the standard rate out there, just like a standard rate to purchase one item or another, may be a standard rate going, which was typically 6% on a 3% for the seller agent, 3% for the buyer agent. But again, it was always negotiated at the listing appointment. Number three, they felt that there was a lack of transparency, that the way the communications were structured under NAR policies made it difficult for buyers and sellers to understand how much they were actually paying. And a lot of this gets kind of wrapped up in the minutia of, when a listing agent goes to sell a house and they talk about their commission rate, they also factor that into that was factored into the sales price when they sell it. A seller is going to say, okay, well, if I sell it for this, that'll help cover your commissions, yada yada. And now the buyer's agent, for the most part, they had no clue what the commission was that was being paid to the listing agent or that was going to be shared with the buyer's agent. Now we're tightening up those disclosures a little bit, and I'm going to talk about that in the next couple slides. And then finally, the fourth thing, it was they're claiming there was a collusion between the brokers, the buyer's broker and the listing broker. I don't know what collusion they were talking about, but they were just saying that it claimed that the member brokers colluded to maintain these high commission rates. I'm not so sure about that, but that was the 4 points that were the main points of the lawsuit. Okay, so in this lawsuit, what has changed as a result of this settlement in the lawsuit? Two main components have changed that you need to be aware of. The first one, and probably the most impactful of the changes, these were not law changes, these were just rules that agents that are part of a National Association of Realtors needs to follow. Number one, before viewing, and this impacts the buyers the most, before viewing any property, a buyer and a real estate agent has to have a written agreement between the two of them. It's called a residential buyer-tenant representation agreement. And basically that spells out the duties of each party that will carry out, and how that buyer's agent is going to be compensated. Now, the biggest impact to buyers is that, and there's been changes to the buyer representation form that basically spells out that the buyer's agent charges X number of dollars or percentage for their services, and that the buyer may be responsible to pay that agent. When I say may, because most buyer's agents are going to try and negotiate with the seller or the listing agent for them to pay his compensation as it has been in the past. Thus, the buyer would not have to do that. It gets kind of confusing, but that's one of the major changes, that before viewing any property, it needs to be understood between the agent and the buyer how the agent's going to be compensated, how much they're going to be compensated, and what are the duties that are expected to be performed by both parties. Number two, and this is really a minor thing to most people except for real estate agents. In the past, we used to be able to see in the MLS if there was a compensation being offered by the seller or the listing agent, what that compensation was for the buyer's agent. And it used to be a field in the MLS that we could see this agent is offering 2% or 3% as a cooperating broker. That has been removed. And so therefore that information is not available to the buyer's agent. And so therefore that information will need to be washed out at the time of offer or whenever. So those were the two changes. Got to have a buyer's representation agreement before viewing any properties that spells out the duties and how much compensation is being paid and who's responsible for that compensation. And number two, they've removed the amount of compensation, if any, that the listing agent or the seller is offering to the buyer's agent. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, now with these changes, there's been a lot of chatter out in the world out there, and I get approached all the time. You know, after this lawsuit, I was getting approached all the time. Hey, I hear sellers don't have to pay commissions anymore. There's lots of false information that's out there, what I call myths about this lawsuit. And I'm going to cover probably 4 of the most important ones. There's lots of other ones out there, but these are the ones I hear most often. Number 1, the settlement forces real estate agents to lower their rates or their fees. Not necessarily true. As I've said in the first slide, a couple slides ago, real estate commissions have always been negotiated between the seller and the listing agent. It now is just more transparent in that who and how much they're being paid. So it does not set any standardized rate for agents. It's still negotiable as it's always been. Number 2, sellers can no longer pay a buyer's agent. False. There's never been an obligation for the seller to pay a buyer's agent. Never has been, but it's always been something that can be negotiated in. The seller, the listing agent, and the seller kind of come to terms if they are willing to offer any compensation to the buyer's agent. Number 3, realtors will no longer be able to set commissions. No, that's false. Again, we've never set commission rates. They've always been negotiable. NAR does not set commissions, and commissions were never always negotiable long before this settlement. Number 4, the settlement will make home ownership more affordable. I don't know about that. I think it could actually have a negative impact on the affordability, just from the simple fact that sellers now may be more stubborn about offering compensation to the buyer's agent. and therefore the buyer may be on the hook to compensate and pay their real estate agent, which thus kind of ties into or kind of digs into the money that they're saving up to purchase a house. So it could have a negative effect technically, but so I don't think it's going to change affordability. This settlement was more about just addressing the antitrust concerns and doesn't address affordability at all. Okay, let's talk about how does this affect me as a buyer. Well, the first thing you need to understand that before you can go and view any property is you have to have a buyer's representation agreement signed by both you and the agent that's representing you. Now, this agreement could be for one house, for one day, a week, a month, for however long you guys work it out in that agreement. And in that agreement, number 2 is it's going to spell out how much that buyer's agent is expecting in compensation for their services. As you know, us agents, we don't work for free. Don't know anybody that does. But it will spell out exactly how much they're expecting to get paid. And the way that the representation agreement is set up, it could say that the buyer is going to be expected to pay the buyer's agent. Now, in most cases, specifically for me anyway, I am going to try and get that money, that compensation covered by either the seller or the listing agent, so that my buyer isn't going to be responsible for that and make their affordability better. But in some cases, the seller or the listing agent may not be willing to do that, and therefore that responsibility may fall back on the buyer to compensate their buyer's agent. So again, this is all negotiable. So when you sit down with the buyer's agent and they walk you through the buyer's representation agreement, make sure you understand that completely. This is some 2 big important changes for the buyer. Let's go into the last. Okay, wasn't that fun? So anyway, in summary about the NAR lawsuit, I would highly recommend you go to the link below or just Google NAR lawsuit and you'll get all kinds of information. But the biggest things from a buyer's perspective is you need to have an agreement written, signed between you and the buyer's agent that's representing you. Make sure you understand it completely. You need that before you go and view any properties. And just understand how the commissions or the compensation is being paid. And make sure you understand your obligations before you go in to any type of transaction. So I hope you found this useful. Sorry for the length, but lawyers, they tend to stretch things out, which I am not one. But anyway, I hope you have a blessed day, and I'll talk to you soon.